Good morning, 5th primary students. Welcome back to Chapter 2 of Oliver Twist. Before starting, you should know that you're not going to be able to proceed without reading and listening to the chapter carefully. And after reading and listening, you should try to answer these questions. Number 1, who do you think Mr. Sowerberry is? Number 2, how do you think life would be like for young Oliver at Mr. Sowerberry's house or at the Sowerberry's house? What does a coffin maker do? Chapter 2, Life with Mr. Sowerberry. So we start the chapter with Oliver being at the workhouse, still at the workhouse. He wasn't given away yet, or he hasn't been given away yet. So at the beginning, Oliver was still locked in the cellar, and at each and every day, Mr. Bumble came to the cellar, took Oliver to the room where the boys ate, and gave him a beating. He beat the boy in front of the other boys to teach them a lesson, and he never gave Oliver food. So Oliver was cold, unhappy, and hungry. One morning, Mr. Bumble introduced us to a new character, Mr. Sowerberry. He was a coffin maker, and he often came to the workhouse because a lot of people died there. And because of his job, because he was a coffin maker, he came to take the dead away and bury them in coffins. So he came to the workhouse pretty often. So he knew Mr. Bumble very well. So Mr. Bumble offered him the boy, offered him to take Oliver and the £5. So Mr. Sowerberry thought for a moment and then decided that he would take Oliver to work with him in the shop. So they made the arrangements, and in the evening Mr. Bumble unlocked the cellar door and told Oliver the news. He told Oliver that he has to be taken away to Mr. Sowerberry's house or shop. Okay, so Oliver tried to hide his tears from Mr. Bumble and Mr. Sowerberry, but he went with them. Mr. Sowerberry took him home, and Mr. Bumble went along with them. He met Mrs. Sowerberry for the first time, and he thought the small, thin woman was angry, and she looked like a fox. At first, Mrs. Sowerberry gave Oliver a good look, and she didn't like him. She thought the boy was very small, and she thought that he would grow on their food and drinks. So she didn't want him, but she had to accept him because Mr. Sowerberry did. So, or needed, the family needed a boy to work at the shop. So she called him a bag of bones. And she tried to scare him of sleeping next to the coffins, and Oliver hardly slept for the first night. He was very hungry, so they gave him the dog's leftovers. So Oliver ate meat for the first time in his life, but they were the dog's leftovers. Imagine eating from the dog's mouth. Come on. They treated him very badly, especially Mrs. Sowerberry. So next, we get a glimpse of what happened around in Mr. Sowerberry's shop. And we learned that there was a servant at the house called Charlotte, and an assistant at the shop called Noah Claypole. And that Noah treated Oliver horribly. He called him, he always teased him. So let's move on. This is a picture of Mrs. Sowerberry, Mr. Sowerberry, and Oliver Twist, and in the back you can see the coffins at the shop. So at Mr. Sowerberry's shop, work was hard, and Noah made Oliver's life even harder. So he tried to tease Oliver whenever he could, and that was because Noah was jealous of Oliver, because Mr. Sowerberry treated the boy kindly. He treated the boy well. So Noah felt jealous, and that's why he made life very hard on poor little Oliver. So whatever the boy tried, whatever Noah tried, he could never make Oliver cry. So he went an extra shot and said that Oliver's mother was a bad woman. So Oliver felt furious. He was very angry. His face went red and he jumped on his feet or to his feet and hit Noah so hard. Noah began to shout, calling for Mrs. Sowerberry and Charlotte. The two women came to help the boy, and they hit Oliver and locked him in the cellar. And when Mr. Sowerberry came home, he also beat the little boy and locked him in the cold cellar and sent him to bed without any food. Alone with the coffins, Oliver was devastated. He was very sad. He cried for a long time, but then he had an idea. Maybe life on the streets of London was a lot better than this life I'm living, with everyone beating me and treating me like I'm not important. So he took everything he owned, and he didn't own much. He owned a shirt, 2 pairs of socks, a piece of bread, and a penny. He tied all of those in a handkerchief and then opened the door and set off to go to London and search for a job there. And that's the end of chapter 2. And as I'm sure you have figured, Oliver's life is very hard. So let's move on. Now to the most important quote in the chapter. And it goes, "Oh yes, he'll grow all right on our food and drink. Get downstairs, you little bag of bones." And this quote is very important because these words were said by Mrs. Sowerberry to Mr. Bumble, then to young Oliver, because the woman thought that Oliver was too much of a responsibility and a waste of food and money. And this shows how greedy and selfish people in London were back then. Those who had the money never helped those who didn't. Even the middle-class shop owners weren't kind-hearted enough to help a small orphan with no place to go. And now with a character sketch. And the first character we have is Mr. Sowerberry. And Mr. Sowerberry is a coffin maker who went to the men's workhouse often because many people died there. He was a tall, thin man who always wore black because of his job. He was kind to Oliver on some occasions, but he wasn't entirely good to the boy because of his wife's effect. He beat Oliver and locked him in the coal cellar right before Oliver decided to run away. Although the man was sometimes kind to Oliver, he wasn't strong enough to stop his wife from hurting the little boy, and he wasn't capable of defending himself against his wife because she was an angry woman. Now we move on to Mrs. Sowerberry. She was a small, angry woman who looked like a fox in Oliver's eyes, so Oliver thought that she looked like a fox. She was married to Mr. Sowerberry, the coffin maker, and she was stronger than him. She was wicked, evil, and felt that Oliver didn't deserve to eat their food or drink. She fed Oliver the dog's food and scared him of sleeping with the coffins. And she was the third female character to be in contact with Oliver, and she wasn't good to him either. So who are the first 2 characters or female characters? The first one was Old Sally and the second one was Mrs. Mann. And the last bubble says she was the reason why Oliver decided to leave the house. If she had stopped Noah from teasing Oliver, Oliver would have stayed with the family. Even though it was hard, but he would have stayed. Next, we have Charlotte, and Charlotte is a servant who worked at Mr. Sowerberry's house, and she liked Noah Claypole and always sided with him against Oliver. And now to Noah. Noah Claypole is a boy who worked at Mr. Sowerberry's coffin shop. He hated Oliver because he was jealous that Mr. Sowerberry treated the boy well. He always teased Oliver and tried to make him cry, but Oliver never did, except when the boy insulted his mother. He is a jealous, evil-hearted, selfish teenager who seeks the attention of his managers. The last and most important one is Oliver. The innocent little boy was hit by Mr. Bumble and sent to the cellar for a whole week without food. He wasn't given food or drink. Instead, he was taken to the room where the boys eat and beaten there. When the boy was taken by Mr. Sowerberry, he couldn't stop his tears because he had to be taken from his surroundings for the second time. He was taken from the only family he had known at the workhouse, his friends and family, the boys who surrounded him at the workhouse. He bowed to Mrs. Sowerberry when he first saw her, which showed how well-behaved the boy was. He ate the dog's food without disgust because of how hungry he was. That was the first time for him to eat meat, which showed how desperate his life was. He hasn't tasted meat for 9 years of his life. Imagine that. The boy was brave and never cared for Noah's insults, and they never made him cry, except when Noah insulted Oliver's mother, and this showed how much the word family had meant to poor little Oliver. Oliver decided to run away and leave the injustice at the Sowerberry's house behind because he was fed up from all the horrid conditions he had faced for the first 9 years of his life. It was better for him to try his luck on the streets of London. Thank you very much for listening. See you next time. Goodbye.